Lesson 13. How to build a Pretotype. It's time to bring together everything we've been talking about in previous lessons and learn how to build a Pretotype. To do this, we'll build on example lean canvases we went through in the previous module. In this lesson, we'll learn how to frame your key market hypothesis, using the XYZ method to say it with numbers, and finding quick ways to test your hypothesis and get data. So, we've done the lean canvas and you've got a sense of what that looks like. But now it's time to work out how to use that lean canvas to say it with numbers and get the data over opinion that you need to validate those ideas. What we're doing here is to go from idea to Pretotype to data, and then from data to decision. And the way we do this is by getting something called the initial level of interest. This is the number of people that viewed our proposition or our offer versus the number of people that actually took action. If you think back to the makeup company with the AI, where customers could upload a selfie and get product recommendations, you're looking for how many people saw that offer versus how many people took part in that offer. These are the numbers that we really care about. So the first thing we do is gather our ideas. We shortlist those ideas, then we push them through a lean canvas to see what makes sense to continue with at that point. This is a great prioritization exercise. We then move on to planning our first Pretotype. So let's get stuck into our Pretotype. Pretotyping follows 5 steps. First, we define something called a key market hypothesis, which I'll talk to you about in a moment. Then we redefine this as an XYZ hypothesis, which is where we say it with numbers. Thirdly, we create something called a Hypozoom, which defines the smallest testable experiment. We then design the experiments or the Pretotype, and finally we run those experiments with real-life customers to get data. Once we've done this first experiment, we get the results and then we use those results to design the next Pretotype. And we do this over and over and over until we see a trend. The trend might go up and show that the idea is working, which is ideal, or the trend might show that customers don't actually care very much about this idea and we can kill that idea. Generally, you get a result after running 4 to 6 of these Pretotypes. So let's break this down into more details. The key market hypothesis. The key market hypothesis is where we're trying to state the key belief or assumption about the market that we can prove or disprove. One way you can get this is by looking at the lean canvas. And if you combine your problem with your early adopters and the solution, you can get to your key market hypothesis. So let's go back to the second-day sushi example. The key market hypothesis there is that people will buy second-day sushi if it's cheap enough. Now that sounds pretty good, and that's normally how you would put statements together if you're brainstorming. But the problem with this is that it's not specific enough. Who are these people, and what does cheap enough mean? We need to be more specific, and this is where we use the XYZ hypothesis format. The XYZ hypothesis. This is what makes Pretotyping so powerful. By agreeing on these numbers up front, we get really clear on what success looks like for these Pretotypes and experiments. Our aim here is to make a statement that puts the numbers up front. So we'd say that X% of Y market will take Z action. Now that sounds like gobbledygook. So what does that mean? Well, with the second-day sushi example, when we say people will buy second-day sushi if it's cheap enough, we say that 20% of packaged sushi buyers, that's the people bit, will buy second-day sushi if it's half the price of fresh sushi. That's the cheap enough bit. So in this case, we've decided that we need 20% of people to take action in order for the idea to be validated. And this is the key difference with the Pretotyping methodology. We're trying to figure out what that number is before we even start testing. The problem with other approaches that we often see is that we go off and run experiments and we fall for vanity metrics. So we'll see that 10,000 people went and did a thing and we give ourselves all a high five. But why does that matter? Maybe it should have been 1 million people, or maybe 100 would have been enough. So we're trying to figure out first, based on our understanding of current trends or existing knowledge of customers and various methods, what is that number? What is good? And don't fall into the trap here of higher is better, because sometimes 0.5% of people doing something is significant, and other times you need 70%. It all depends on what you're testing. The Hypozoom. Once you've figured out this XYZ hypothesis, you want to go and run that experiment as a Hypozoom. Now the word Hypozoom was made up by Alberto, and all it means is a small testable version of your bigger hypothesis. With the sushi example, we can't necessarily test whether 20% of packaged sushi buyers will buy a second-day sushi if it's half price, because that's not specific enough. But we can look at that hypothesis and ask, how could we test that this afternoon or tomorrow morning? What's a baby version of that hypothesis? We could, for example, go 20% of Stanford students buying sushi at Cooper Cafe on campus today at lunch would buy second-day sushi if it's half the price of fresher sushi. Is that testable? Absolutely. You could go and do that pretty much straight away if you were on campus. If that baby hypothesis or that small test or prototype worked, then we could build out the experiment and learn more and design more experiments. But if it didn't work, then there's some underlying assumption we've made that's wrong, and we need to tweak the experiment and go and run a new one. Choosing the right prototype method. Now that we know specifically what we're trying to learn and get data for, it's time to run the prototype. But how do you choose the right method? One approach I use is to ask myself, what is the simplest experiment to get data as fast as possible? In other words, how can I get data from customers for $0 in 24 hours? Typically we start with a fake door, as it's the easiest to set up and simplest way to get data without complexity. But sometimes your product or service is of a nature that needs more work up front. Don't get carried away and overexcited here. It's tempting to build something with all the bells and whistles. Stop. We know you can build something, but should you? So some tips here. There is no right prototype to start with. It depends on what you're trying to learn and from who. Don't bother designing the next experiment until you have results from the first, because the point is to learn from your customers which assumptions are right and wrong. So adjust your Hypozoom and do it again with a new prototype for the second one. When you run the prototype, be brave and direct. I can't overstate this. Don't soften the message so it looks and feels like an experiment. None of this launching soon or would you like this or express your interest nonsense. The customer must believe that your offer is real and available right now, else all you get is opinion. So to recap this lesson, what we're really trying to do with each idea is identify the key market hypothesis, say it with numbers using the XYZ, make it testable with a Hypozoom, and then design and run prototypes using the methods we went through earlier. Once again, the way to decide which method to use is to ask, which method will get us testing this idea with customers the fastest? And that's prototyping in a nutshell. In the next lesson, I'll take you through an example of how we can use the key market hypothesis, the XYZ hypothesis, and the Hypozoom to design a sample prototype. And then you'll be able to use the lean canvas you've already filled in to build out your own sample prototype.